Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Mary Spetta, and I'm the Chief Impact Officer at Amira. I'm also the host of this webinar series that we've been doing once a month this year, celebrating survivor leadership and learning from survivor leaders across the country working in the anti-trafficking movement. If you're not familiar with Amira, we are a nonprofit here in New England, providing exit and aftercare services to women who have survived commercial sexual exploitation. We do that in a lot of ways, and you can find out more about that at amirainc.org. And so today's conversation is going to be, I'm really excited for today's conversation. We have Roxie Farrow with us today, and hopefully she'll be able to hop on here in a minute. So Roxie and I connected through her work at the Human Trafficking Legal Center. There she is. Hi, Roxie. So Roxie is the operations manager for the Human Trafficking Legal Center in Washington, D.C., which is a labor trafficking advocacy organization that focuses on connecting pro bono attorneys with trafficking survivors. It's really incredible work. She developed and currently leads the Survivor Leadership Program designed to enhance leadership skills of survivors in the US and in the United Kingdom. Prior to joining the Legal Center, she dedicated 15 years to behavioral health industry as a mental health clinician, recently served as senior admissions coordinator and manager for the Psychiatric Institute of Washington, a behavioral health treatment facility in DC. She's also a survivor leader consultant for the University of Maryland Support Advocacy, Freedom, and Empowerment Center for Human Trafficking Survivors, serving on the Human Trafficking Clinicians Collaborative and the Human Trafficking Survivors Council. She has a wealth of wisdom and experience to share with us, and I am so glad that you are able to come and have this conversation with me today. Roxie, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Mary, for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about this. Hello, everybody. As Mary says, my name is Roxie, and I work with the Human Trafficking Legal Center as the operations manager, as well as the lead for the Survivor Leadership Program. Just to give you a brief kind of overview of what the Survivor Leadership Program is it's designed to create a safe space for survivors to learn from both survivors and experts or other professionals on topics that survivors experience and face on a daily basis. Some areas of focus include things like combating tax issues, economic empowerment, and how to engage with the press. So quite recently, we had a lot of requests to address survivor inclusion from both survivors and advocates. This triggered a series of survivor leadership webinars designed to push the anti-trafficking networks towards addressing survivor inclusion, both within the anti-trafficking movement and as well as within organizations and institutions.
It's great. It's a fantastic series that you have been hosting through the Legal Center. And we welcome your little one today too, in the background there. He's adorable. Work from home life.
Gotta love it.
Yes. So for anyone that's brand new to this idea or new to the field, can you talk about why survivor inclusion is important, and why it's not, you know, I think that we think about the work that we do in the sense of like, you know, get the movement going, get the mission going, and then think about survivor inclusion, and really how this is more of, this needs to happen at the beginning rather than the end. Can you talk about like how this is actually core?
Sure. So let me just first start off about survivor inclusion in general. So this whole idea came up because, as we all know, the anti-trafficking movement started way before the idea of including survivors or having survivor leaders within the organization. And this came up because what we begin to notice is that there were a lot of practices, policies, and laws being developed for survivors, but not necessarily with survivors, or within like the collaborating with survivors. And the same began to happen, nothing for us without us. So then we saw the trend of survivors being included in that process, being included in the decision-making of policies, laws, and other things regarding survivor leadership. More survivors have been invited to the table. More survivors have been hired by other organizations to participate, to see whether or not, or to help center survivor voices. And that's kind of the core of it all, centering survivor voices, as well as ensuring that survivors are also included in the decision-making process of any practice, policy, or law that will impact them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so important because, when we're working to serve a population, the only way to really know if the service that we are trying to provide, or the support or the law that we are trying to implement is going to be beneficial is by actually engaging with that population and having that population tell us what they need. So for us as survivors, I mean, we are experts in our own experiences, and this is true of survivors of anything. And so that expertise informs the work.
Exactly. So survivors are at the receiving end of every decision made by organizations. And to ensure that these decisions have a positive impact on the lives of survivors, organizations and institutions must begin to move towards envisioning and implementing authentic practices that assist in empowering survivors.
Yes. I wonder, can you talk a little bit about the difference between what we call tokenism? And so that might be a new term for anyone participating. But can you talk a little bit about tokenism, what that means, and the difference between that and inclusion? Because I think sometimes tokenism is mistaken for true inclusion.
Yes, and I'm glad you asked that question, because there are a few things that happen when the result is tokenism. So first, I just kind of want to talk about the definition of tokenism. So tokenism is the practice of making only performative or symbolic efforts to be inclusive to members of marginalized community. And of course, in this sense, we're speaking about trafficking survivors, especially by recruiting people from underrepresented groups in order to give the appearance of inclusion within the workplace. So we see this happening a lot within the anti-trafficking community when institutions recruit survivors. Now, sometimes this plays out because perhaps the organization or institution is only just beginning inclusion efforts, or perhaps the organization genuinely wants to include survivors, but have not yet reevaluated internal practices, such as like diversity, equity, and inclusion, or measures regarding that within the organization. They haven't even like reevaluated internal systems or structures to see if they're even prepared or even have the capacity to include survivors and to do this type of work. So that's some of the things that we see that lead up to tokenism. It's not something that I see so much happening like on a malicious level, but even on a broader sense, when we are talking about inclusion or diversity, we all understand that these practices take time. Certain trends and research suggest that one part of a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative, when being implemented within an organization, can take up to 8 years to do it right. And so with that being said, there are a lot of changes that occur within institutions and organizations when attempting or approaching these types of measures. But the key is doing it correctly, having the conversations, and then trying something, failing, and then learning from those mistakes. I think a lot of institutions, organizations, especially within the anti-trafficking world, because let's face it, like this community, of the anti-trafficking community and their organizations were developed based off of wanting to help. So yes, we understand that these organizations are here to help and they want to help. I mean, from whether it's in a legal capacity or in a direct service capacity. However, wanting to help is good, but it's also understanding the other part of it, of how do we provide help that is not only authentic, but also sustainable to both the organization as well as those that you recruit, like survivor leaders.
Yes. Yeah. So let's get into that a little bit because, as you said, tokenism usually it's not malicious. It's usually coming from a place of genuinely wanting to include survivors, but just like not really knowing how to do it. So let's talk a little bit about that. You talked about how the anti-trafficking movement was really founded by allies, and that makes sense. I mean, you have to have someone come along to like pull someone out, help and to support someone coming out of trafficking in order for that person to truly become a survivor. That's how we built survivor communities, right? And so that is incredible work. And so now we are in the next stage where we have so many survivor leaders ready to go, ready to participate, and so many survivors coming up and coming who are looking for those opportunities to use their expertise and to contribute to the movement. And so many ally organizations who want to find a way to create spaces where survivor and allies can form true partnerships and true teams together. So with this, that means that these spaces were built by allies and they're comfortable for allies. But when we think about survivor inclusion, we need to think about rebuilding those spaces to be comfortable for survivors and allies. So how can teams look at their current structures and systems to see if these are spaces where survivors truly feel included?
So that was a lot of questions. However, I'm going to take it part by part.
Yeah.
So when it comes to structures, when it comes to, I'm going to back up a little bit. A lot of our anti-trafficking institutions and organizations are nonprofit. So when we're looking at the nonprofit organizations or the nonprofit industrial complex, these institutions were built based off of a dominant culture. And so they operate as that, And so now we have this new emerging thing about survivor inclusion, equity, diversity, and we want to help, and we want to include these practices and policies. However, we aren't necessarily looking at the dominant culture or the policy and the internal practices within our system that support the status quo. So now, especially since last year, June, where a lot of organizations, a lot of survivors, those from marginalized communities, are faced with these racial issues, and they are kind of stuck about how to address this, and not to just address it so that they look good, but also address them in an authentic way so that they can also support those that they serve or that they're hiring. So with that being said, it's really important to recognize that your organization is running on a dominant culture. What type of culture would you like to provide to sustain survivor leaders and or survivor-led relationships, partnerships? Those are the things that you have to start with. And we all know that because these organizations are built on a dominant culture, they're hierarchical. So this process will have to begin or will start and go from the top to the bottom. And a lot of it starts with the board. Are they having these conversations? Are leaders within the organizations having these conversations? And I bring that up because, what I see sometimes is that, organizations want to hire survivors. They hire them. And then they consistently get stuck about how to sustain this. They don't know if they're supporting them the right way. Are we empowering the survivor leader, or are we telling the survivor what they need? Are we telling our clients what they need, as opposed to stepping back and creating that space for survivors to make those decisions by themselves? So with that being said, when it comes to reevaluating organizational cultures or systems, this takes time. And traditionally, it's going to take a lot of time. Just put it that way. So if anti-trafficking organizations have not yet had any difficult conversations or have not done any work on race or inequity, or if leaders within those organizations are too afraid to even say the words racism or white supremacy and address the policies and practices that sustain the status quo within the culture, then it may be time to revisit ways of how to change this in order to begin shifting the culture to authentically recruiting, supporting, and sustaining survivor leaders as both clients and employees.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So true, because so much of trafficking and exploitation is rooted in institutional racism.
Exactly. And I know people like, oh, racism, everyone wants to talk about racism. And it seems like, a term that people keep throwing around. However, studies show that if you understand the issues around race and the inequalities that exist within that, then you understand everything else when it comes to gender issues, when it comes to issues regarding how we approach mental health within the workplace, how we approach other issues that we have in our society. If you understand how to not only acknowledge the racial issues as well as the lack of inequity within your organization, then you will then begin to understand how to address everything else that comes after that. I also want to make it a point that it's really important for leaders within organizations and institutions to do the work. You know, it's one thing to lead an anti-trafficking organization or an institution off the intentions of wanting to be helpful. It's another thing to stop and to think and ask yourself the question whether or not you're doing the work with yourself, within your own community, and at home. Because if you're not doing that work within your own community, however, every day you're coming into an organization that's meant to help people, then of course there can be some type of conflict involved. We will run right back into those performative actions as well as, not understanding how to move forward. If you aren't prepared as a leader or as an institution or organization to address these issues, then I think this is a moment to pause.
Yeah. So let's talk about that doing the work piece of it. Let's say we have someone who recognizes this and wants to do something about it and wants to do the work, but now it's like, okay, well, tell me what the work is. Like, what do I need to do? Can you break that down? What does the work look like individually, and what does the work look like in whatever organizational or communal structure you're in?
Individually, I'll start there. Individually, the first question you have to really recognize, and this is not just to all of our white leaders, but it's also to leaders in general. Ask yourself, what are your values individually? What are your values? Do you truly and authentically value the work that you do? Do you value this change? And then from there, connect yourself with, there are plenty of trainings out here, workshops. Have these conversations or these hard conversations about checking your privilege, understanding how you're benefiting from a system that also impacts and does not benefit another group of people, and have those and start there. Because 9 times out of 10, when the person individually begins to do the work, it will reflect in their leadership and within their organization. So that's where a person can start there, educating yourself, having an accountability partner, and that's something that's not really talked about because individually, especially if those individuals are leaders, I guess, we're focused on leading. We're focused on leading, but part of being a leader is being a forever student. And then part of learning is actually holding yourself accountable to the new information that's being brought to you and understanding how to then use that information and, use it within the organization that you work in. So with organizations, doing the work means pausing. It means pausing. A lot of times within this field, we have a tendency to rush, or there's a lot of urgency around meeting deadlines because we know these grants, there's a deadline, and they're highly restricted. And so sometimes with being a leader within an organization or institutions, if you're using, grant money or, money coming from the state, federally funded, then you do have you do feel pressured. There's a tendency to feel pressured. So the first thing that needs to happen is doing an assessment within your organization. Just like you individually, you'll do an assessment with your values, it's the same thing within your organization. Assess your organization to see whether or not they have the capacity to sustain this type of inclusion. Again, if these conversations are being had, then maybe the first step is to begin to have these conversations internally within, between staff members, asking staff members how they feel, and what they need and what they want to see. And then from there, when it comes to the policies and practices within organizations, I believe that, people should begin to look at them and reimagine them in the context of restorative justice, because truly that's what we're dealing with at this point. And so, that even means maybe taking a look at your employee handbook, revisiting your policies and your practices and your procedures, how you deal with mental health, how you deal with days off or paid time off, all those little things count and they help into building a culture that sustains survivors or survivor leaders. And I'm not just talking about those that we employ, but also those that we serve as clients, because from the behavioral health, there's this old saying, patient care is directly connected to those who are caring for them. And so if those practitioners and or advocates within the organizations aren't getting their needs met when it comes to having a culture that sustains them on multiple levels, then 9 times out of 10, the result would be where they won't be able to serve clients or our survivors that we're serving in the field in a way where it's authentic as well as sustainable.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that the way that we respond to and incorporate survivors on our teams speaks volumes when we are serving survivors directly.
Yes.
Yeah, like I know that's something that was huge for me when I first joined. Mira was the first place that I worked that was an anti-trafficking organization, and meeting another survivor on staff and just being able to like bask in her wisdom. And I think that when we're serving a population, when they can turn around and look to see that the people serving them are the people, sometimes they're allies and sometimes they're survivors, but when they're survivors, that person did not have the exact same experience that you did, but shares that same pain, had that same, bears the same burdens, and look at where they are. And look at the allies who gave them that opportunity and who said, come build this with us. That can be so healing, such a healing message in and of itself to the survivors that we're serving.
Yes, and I'm glad you said that, because it's also about sharing power. One other question, individually as well as organizations have to ask themselves is, are you willing to share power? Are you willing to share power? And what are you willing to lose? Because when you're going from shifting from a dominant culture to something that is serving people or serving others, you're going to lose something. And you have to ask yourself individually, what are you willing to lose? And as an organization or institution, what are you willing to lose? And are you okay with that? Because that's going to make you feel uncomfortable, both individually and, within an organization. It's going to feel uncomfortable. And so it's about also leaning into being uncomfortable, feeling how uncomfortable that is, and then addressing it from there with true authenticity as well as transparency. So, being transparent is another big thing within organizations that I see that hire survivors, but also are at the beginning stages of developing practices and policies to sustain survivors and empower survivor leadership. So being transparent means, not just having that check-in or, not just having these staff meetings, but A, do you have a survivor at every level of your organization informing these decisions? B, if not, then, do you have board members who check in periodically with survivors or staff members to create that sense of transparency, and so that information is just not hidden? Because everybody wants to know what to expect when they're in an organization. And then what you'll also see is how that impacts those that you're serving as well. So, sharing power and sharing information is another way to create that culture of empowerment for both survivors as well as just everyone else who's working within these organizations. And I think it's just a tendency not to do that. Like I said, I talked about dominant culture before. If we feel like we have control of all of the information, and we'll break off a piece of information here, or we might be planning to change a policy or practice, but we're not really going to share that with our staff because that's just not how things go, But, you'll be surprised once you begin to open up and include people into these decision-making process.
Yeah. So I was just about to ask you about recommendations that you would have for teams to become more survivor inclusive. And so I feel like you've already kind of gone in that direction. That goal of having a survivor at every level of your organization, because then you have that lived experience, that expertise, that buy-in, because then you've really got that partnership. What you were talking about with power sharing, that's partnership. That's what true collaboration looks like. So what are some other ways? I know you touched on mental health, how you handle vacation policies, that kind of stuff. What are some tangible ways that teams can become more survivor inclusive?
So I did mention before beginning to have these conversations internally between staff and leaders and board members. One thing that I believe that organizations can begin to do is have these conversations, however, also incorporate a third party that can help facilitate these conversations, because we all know we have our own biases, implicit bias, attribution bias, where, sometimes it's a blind spot. A lot of the times we don't even know that we are being biased or we have this type of thinking, but it's helpful to include a third party to help you look in the mirror, as well as have these conversations with those who may also be having their own bias, not just with biases between who they talk to within their organizations, but also the biases that are pertaining to survivors, especially that bias that comes with being a survivor. And I feel like there's this thing where people see survivors, no matter on whatever level of the organization that they serve, there's this bias to say, oh, they're still a victim. So therefore, they treat them as a victim. Therefore, they make the decisions about what they believe is good for them and what they believe it isn't good for them and what they believe is good for them to grow. Well, if a person is operating like that within your organization or internally, and I'm like, again, it's not malicious, then that is something that should be addressed in a way where it's careful. However, everyone sees the benefit out of it. Secondly, I think that to ensure that this conversation and or initiative with survivor inclusion doesn't stall out, there has to be a consistent movement to ensure that this is mobilized. So if you say, like last June, everybody attempted to respond. I'm just using this as an example. However, it doesn't necessarily go with the survivor inclusion part. Everybody wanted to respond in reference to Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. So we put out our Black squares, we put out the hashtag Black Lives Matter, But again, because these conversations weren't happening internally and or there wasn't anything in the strategic plan to support how to mobilize this initiative and can be consistent about it, a lot of organizations and institutions begin to stall out. And so with that impact, or the impact that has, is that, well, then now those within your organizations are questioning, hey, was this real to begin with? And then it impacts their ability to serve others. If you have a survivor within your organization or survivor leader, and using that same example and putting in a different frame of survivor inclusion, when you begin survivor inclusive initiatives and then you stop and then you reprioritize and you shelf it again, well, then every time that happens, that will impact the motivation of the survivor leader and those that you're working with, because, well, they begin to feel, hey, is this real? Is it something that my company or my organization or institution values?
Yeah, taking it from superficial to transformative.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the, we just did a little brief training about this at Amira. And I think what you talked about in there is so important, that sort of stereotype or bias that can come along with the label survivor. And you know, that's kind of like the sticky point in the anti-trafficking movement, is that in some ways, when you're a survivor, you have clout in certain circles, but in other circles you have stigma, because there's like the you know, oh, she survived, like, you know, how brave, how wonderful in some circles, but then in other circles it's she's still a victim kind of a thing. And I think one of the key things here is that when we have survivors in the anti-trafficking movement who are using the experience that they did not ask for to inform the work in front of them, that's now become a line on their resume that they didn't necessarily ask for, but they are turning it into education. And I think it is so important for teams to reflect survivors' experience in the way that they are utilizing it. So if a survivor leader comes into a space as a professional and is using our lived experience as an informative piece, that's an educational piece. And that's a professional in front of you, in the same way that someone who goes to school and learns a bunch of things and employs that in the professional work in front of them. It's a different kind of lived experience.
Yes, and I think that that also not just takes reflection, but it takes practice with actively listening. And individuals actively listen, just like organizations actively listening. And so when I use the term actively listening, it's about not just sitting there waiting to respond, both individually or as an organization, but taking that information in,
Mm-hmm.
matching it up or pairing it with what's already there, seeing things for what it is, and then transforming it into something new. And I think that because we within this movement and within institutions and organization, that there's that sense of urgency, then we skip a few steps when it comes to active listening, because we want to just get to the bottom line. We want an answer. We want to check that box. But every time we skip that, what happens is that we miss the opportunity to truly connect your desire to help, but also connect the survivor leader and your clients to opportunities of empowerment.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like you said, we miss that opportunity to become partners.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I want to ask you the million dollar question here, which is, you know, for teams that are trying to do this, trying to become more survivor inclusive, ultimately this is about building trust, because the place that you're going to get the information about how to be most inclusive is from survivors. So when teams want to go to the survivors on their team and say, hey, how can we do this better? How can allies set up a safe space to have this conversation so that survivors have the opportunity to speak their truth and not feel like there's going to be any sort of repercussions or blowback?
Speak the truth. Because just like you said, survivors are bringing to organizations experience they didn't necessarily ask for. And so if we are truly looking at survivors as those with lived experience and the experts from their experience, then we can only speak the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm saying that, of course, you know, professionalism comes into play, and understanding the issues surrounding positional power, you know, that also has something to do with it. However, the best thing to do is be authentic and speak the truth. Now, can you make an organization accept the truth? No. Are organizations prepared to listen? That's really the question. Are they prepared to listen?
Mm-hmm.
Because even though they may ask, how do we want this to change, where the solution that the survivor or survivor leader may present, that organization may not have the capacity to implement that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, then there's conflict, because then you got the survivor leader saying, hey, they're not listening to me. But in reality, they don't have the capacity and they're not prepared to implement things like that. And so it's really about, on one side with the survivor leader, understanding where that organization is,
Right.
you know? And then on the organization side is listening. If this is something, and transparency, if this is something you're asking for, listen. Be transparent about the boundaries that your organizations operate in. Be transparent about your values. Be transparent about the framing of everything, of your goals and your missions and your objectives. And I think I feel like that's an issue that will forever come up because, like I said, this is a initiative, or this is a change that will take time, you know. But again, if survivors are speaking to you and you're asking them for their expertise, you're either going to listen or you're not, you know. And it's great. It's great on both sides. You have a survivor giving you that information. If you choose not to listen, that is on that organization. However, what can happen too is survivors can also take that information and use it somewhere else in that way. And so, the feeling of being empowered can still continue to empower yourself, but also, begin to build those relationships with just leaders and other staff within the organizations that speak that language.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And ultimately, all of this is for the goal of serving the individuals out there who need the service better. It is about being better service providers. It is about being better lawyers. It is about being more informed in our work. And I think the other thing that this is about is that if we are really about ending trafficking and ending exploitation and creating opportunities for survivors, it's got to start with us. Because when we create leadership opportunities for survivors, we are giving the opportunity for those survivor leaders to become role models, and for more and more people to see, hey, she made it. Hey, he made it. I can do the same thing. And by doing that, we are lifting people up, right? What is that phrase? We rise by lifting others.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah. Well, from here, we're gonna go into a Q&A time. And so if you have a question, feel free to drop it in the Q&A box. If you drop it in the chat, I might not see it, but I will do my best to check that. But go ahead and drop your questions in the Q&A box. We have a really good one here. The question is, if there is one question you wish allies and coworkers would ask survivors on staff, whether they just started or have been working together for a period of time, what would it be?
How would you summarize our culture? Do you think that we're prepared to authentically recruit survivors and sustain them? And I know you said one question, but I think these are two very important questions. Because what people pay thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to get this information from consultants, you have a person with lived experience right there. Again, if you choose to take that information and consider it valuable, that's what you choose to do. But that right there will assist with creating the culture that you want. That will assist with bringing up new ideas that can assist with serving the client that you're already serving and finding new ways to serve them in a way where they feel empowered.
Good, so good. Here's another one. Do you have any recommendations for having a discussion with a coworker that you feel is judging survivors or judging the choice to include survivors?
I'm sorry, can you say the first part again?
Sure. Do you have any recommendations for having a discussion with a coworker that you feel is judging survivors or judging the choice to include survivors?
I'm going to answer that a few ways. So again, I'm going to revisit bias. So if a person may be judging survivors or judging the process, then that can be coming from a bias that they don't even know that they have. And so when you address things or, a person in this manner, it is very, very, very important that it's not a reaction or you're not being reactive to having this conversation. again, this conversation should lead to, progress, and it should lead to a sense of everybody feeling like they can give their input. And so the person expressing these things and they feel like they're people are judging them, then you have to approach this carefully. One, I would say that have this conversation within a group so that the person doesn't feel attacked. And then B, I know consultants, I'm going back and forth with them. You might want to bring in a third party to have these conversations. Because depending on where they are in the organization, if they are judging it, especially if they're a leader, if they're judging this, then it's almost always impacting the way they're leading their organization and the services that are coming out of it. And so, I would just say that have these conversations over and over and over again, and be very careful about how we are having these conversations. And sometimes it may mean that you are not the person to have the conversation with them.
I want to ask you a follow-up question here. What do you think about engaging individuals who might be struggling with the idea of survivor inclusion by sharing positive experiences or ways in which survivors have contributed in a big way? Do you know what I mean? Like pointing to moments where, like, this situation was made better, or our team was made better because of survivor input.
Yes, I think that is helpful. And I also think what also can help in this is using other organizations as examples as well. And so as humans, we're very tunnel vision. And so if we have the more examples that we have to go off of, and the more things that we can see it from outside or from outside of our perspective that other people are doing, then more than likely we're like, oh, okay, maybe this does work. We'll begin to consider whether or not we want to go through that process. So I think that that's also something that can be brought into the equation when it comes to those who are struggling with survivor inclusion. Oftentimes, if someone's struggling with survivor inclusion, they're struggling with some type of issues related to how they're approaching diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if that's the case, then that person may have to step back or pause and do more work within their community.
Yeah. So then the flip side of this question is, do you have recommendations for survivors who are on teams who have ideas for how to be more survivor inclusive? Do you have recommendations to survivors for how they can initiate those conversations with allies in a way that will generate conversation and not, like, just a blank wall?
Yes. So this can happen it can happen in many different ways. So the first way, you can have that interpersonal conversation where you just go into a coworker and say, hey, use them as a balance board. What do you think about this? What do you think about this idea? Because 9 times out of 10, before you approach the leader or anyone higher than that, the coworker, especially if they came before you or if they were hired before you, they'll be able to give you a lot more insight regarding the values and the culture of the organization. The lived practice versus the espoused practices, meaning those that are maybe put on paper or said publicly, but not necessarily practiced within the organization. And so that way, it'll give you some type of context of how to bring these concerns or new ideas to the leader. And then have that conversation in that way. And I just want to be transparent about this. A lot of the times you're just going to get a blank wall. You might just get a blank wall and it's not malicious. It's a blank wall because that other person may not just be prepared. They may not have the information or the capacity to move forward or the bandwidth, at that point. And so it's also about boundaries, understanding, where your boundary is. And so with that being said, if you are consistently hitting that wall or finding that there's a blank space, figure out ways of where you can be heard. Where people, find those spaces where if you do say something, there's likely to be a conversation. There's this great organization called Survivor Alliance. It's a survivor-led organization. And that's a great space that survivors can join as members and begin to have those conversations and interact with members and continue to talk about survivor inclusion and new ideas related to that. And then from there, you can also gather new ideas about how to bring it up within organizations and understanding it from that way. But having those safe spaces are definitely beneficial.
Yeah.
Because it leads to being able to reassess and self-evaluate. Because as much as I don't like to say it, I hate saying goodbye, but sometimes you have to, again, understand your boundaries. Is this a place for you as a survivor leader? You know, an organization may be at a spot where they're just beginning. However, you've probably already done your work. You've probably already surpassed this. So as a survivor leader, it's time to ask yourself some questions. Is this a place for you, or are there other places that can help you continue to grow as a survivor leader?
What are some tangible recommendations for survivor inclusion from your perspective? And I think that this is getting at like kind of some of the stuff that we talked about as far as mental health and stuff like that. For example, at Amira, we have our vacation policy is fantastic. We have mandatory 1 week per quarter. You have to take Monday to Friday. And then you have a personal spiritual retreat day. In addition to that, you have to take per quarter. And then you have unlimited vacation after that. So if you need a day off. So like we value rest so much for survivors and allies alike, because the work is hard. The work is very hard. And when you're a survivor, you're confronted with your own trauma constantly as well. So what are some recommendations, kind of like that you might suggest that organizations kind of think about in survivor inclusion?
So I'll start from the top. So when it comes to leaders, I think that one thing leaders can do is to consistently or have this culture walk. So implementing a culture walk basically meaning, and I know right now we're in the times of the pandemic, so this might be a little trickier than most. Right. But literally walking around your organization and looking at it from an objective perspective to see, hey, is this something that works? Does this system work? Does this process work? Are the people working here happy? One thing I would like to say, I'm glad you brought up leave. I would like to talk about kind of work-life balance. So, we used to have this traditional thought that, or, theory of work-life balance in regards to how people operate within organizations that, life stops when you walk through the door of work. But from what we've learned through this pandemic is that it's a continuum. So, especially now that people are working more and more remotely, they're juggling things like parenting and virtual schools and sickness and a lot of loss, you know what I mean? And so when you're doing your culture walk as leaders or leaders within these organizations, those are some of the things that you want to begin to look at. And see how your organization, or just, look at the capacity and see if you are able to sustain it, how you can begin to shift having policies that are more people-centered. And I think that's one thing that they can do. Now, when it comes to policies as well as systems and practices, I think that the best thing to do is educate yourself first on restorative justice. And in some instances, depending on what your values are within organizations, I know a lot of organizations who are leaning towards systems of like decolonizing. So it's actually taking those steps to not only identify the dominant culture, but also then, say, hey, listen, this isn't working for us. Board, this isn't working for us. How can we begin to now, undo the issue or undo the system and then move forward towards rebuilding, And some organizations have that capacity, some don't. But okay, baby, 1 second, I'll get it. Don't worry, I'll get it. So I think that, just to land the plane in this, I think that looking at your policies and your practices, that's something tangible that you can start to do. Read them, like read them. You know, some people got an employee handbook, don't ever read them. Read them. And from your experiences just from this year alone, think about it. Think about ways of how you can reapproach that, how you can rewrite it. I know another thing that's come into like making organizations or their cultures more sustainable for all people is looking at the dress code. That's another thing. Looking at the way, I don't want to say you punish employees, but you know, when people make mistakes in the organizations, it's the traditional thing to write them up or, you know, find a way to push them out the organization. Well, are we really going for that anymore? Are we looking for more restorative ways to empower those? And I'm not saying that, you know, you're keeping everybody on and who obviously may not be a good fit, but I'm also saying is that, you know, if you truly value this person and you understand, and they've communicated with you, you guys have this partnership on a professional level where, you know that they can be more effective in the role that they're playing, then maybe you want to introduce things like mentorship within your organization. You know what I mean? Etching out a path for those to get to where you believe they need to be, and consistently reevaluate that, as opposed to just having one performance evaluation and then, hey, you get all twos because, you know, you didn't meet the goals of the organization, but building something in so that they can meet these goals.
Sure. And I think along with that, something that I would add on is that there are certain challenges that are common to survivors that are no fault of their own. It's the result of trauma, things like PTSD, anxiety, performance anxiety, particularly, struggling with how to address authority in a workplace environment, conflict resolution. These are things that, to no fault of the survivor, these are the results of trauma. And there are fantastic trainings out there, fantastic books about how to manage PTSD in the workplace, how to be an authority figure for individuals who have experienced trauma. And so I think that that's also something that leaders can do, is to invest in understanding the challenges that survivors come to work with, because we don't leave that stuff at home. And so it's very important that we're creating a safe space in our workplace, in our teams, and making sure that everyone on the team is equipped with that information, not just the people at the top, but everyone, however your organization is structured, because survivors interact with everyone on the team. And so it's going to be really important that it can actually function like a team, and there aren't people feeling like, well, I can trust some people, but I can't trust everybody.
Thank you. That's something really great, because calling out and burning out is real, you know, on all levels. Burnout is real. And so, you know, I think that is really important to look at those types of things as well. Like if you have somebody who's calling out, and I only bring this up because I've seen this happen within the workplace with survivors. Survivor call out, continuously call out, and the leader of the organization just really didn't understand what to do. You know, oh, this is affecting the bottom line, the work isn't getting done. But, you know, as this leader became more aware, they realized that there is a such thing as PTSD. You know what I mean? Survivors will revisit, you know, the trauma, especially within the anti-trafficking movement. You know, there's the lived trauma, and then there's a vicarious trauma. And that happens not just with survivors, but all those within those who work within the community. So I think that it's important to just consistently educate yourself about those, because PTSD, that's an invisible illness. That's an invisible disability. And just like high blood pressure is invisible until it gets to a certain point, but you know, just like we are able to incorporate practices and policies within our organizations to accommodate that, then we should also be able to accommodate things like PTSD and other issues that may arise as, you know, that comes directly from being trafficked. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something really, really good. And I think it's great that organizations continue to do the work and read and go to these workshops as much as possible.
And of course, one of the great positive outcomes of doing this work and creating a more survivor inclusive environment is all of these things end up positively affecting the non-survivors on your team. You can be an ally with PTSD from a different form of trauma. And so I don't think that there's a single recommendation or policy or anything that a survivor would ever make that wouldn't also benefit non-survivors on the team. So it actually creates a more positive work environment for everybody. It's not being exclusive or specific to one group of people. These are policies we want to implement across the team so that everyone feels the positive effects of this. Yeah. Well, that's all the time we have for today. There was a question in the chat about if this was recorded so you could watch it again. Yes, it is being recorded. We are going to post it on our YouTube channel and on our website. We will send a follow-up email to everyone who watched today with a link to the webinar. Thank you so much for being here. Roxie, thank you, thank you, thank you. So grateful for the work that you're doing. So grateful for you being here today and sharing your amazing wealth of wisdom with us.
Thank you so much, Mary, for having me here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. And I think that even after this presentation, I encourage everyone to continue to have this conversation and consistently do the work because just like on all levels, the work is really important. And we, as both survivor leaders as well as advocates within the anti-trafficking community, the more we do this work, the more we're able to share power and have partnerships, not just individually, but with other organizations as well.
Yes, so true. So thank you all for being here today. Make sure you subscribe to our newsletter to learn about the webinars that are coming up for the rest of the year. We have one each month in this series where we invite a survivor leader to come and talk about their expertise. So make sure you register for our upcoming webinars. Thank you all.